here are some of the things in terms of the agenda that we'll talk about. The matrix, just a little bit, some of these standard reports like an Excel edit list, instance frequency report, and an XML edit list. Feel free to stop me. I mean, it says the format's demonstration, but feel free to stop and ask questions at any time about anything. And then I'll show you the statistical window, or the stat window we call it, which is like a customizable report in Studiocode. And then if we have time, I want to show you a little teaser closely tied to reporting, obviously, is how to visualize data. And that probably is, that is planned for data visualization. That is planned for a different webinar, but I thought maybe it'd be good just to whet your appetite a little bit if we have a few minutes there and you can see what that looks like. And then afterwards, we can have, questions about really anything Studiocode related that you like. So yeah, all right, so we'll start. Let's minimize that, and I will start recording. So, there's a few different standard reports in Studiocode. One of the first ones you get introduced to is the matrix here on the timeline. So after you've coded, you can open up this matrix, and gives you a nice little grid filter tool based on your codes, which are rows, and your labels, which are columns. It's really easy to just single click on a cell and isolate those instances down in the timeline. I can double click on that cell. It'll go retrieve those 9 clips and play them back to back in this single window. I can export it to Excel and do a number of different things in the matrix in terms of drilling down and looking for more specific counts and things like that. I'm not going to spend too much time on the matrix though, because we just had a whole webinar dedicated to just the matrix last month, and that's online. So feel free to look at that. But know that, the matrix is probably one of the most utilized places to look at a report. And much like some of our other reports, I think one of the most powerful things about the matrix is that it's married to the evidence, right? It's not just statistical information. You can go and actually double click on these cells and retrieve the video there. So, all right, so that's just a very, very short overview of the matrix. Another report that's helpful, especially if your coding or your analysis is anything temporally based, or anything duration related. So if you go to File, Export, that's where these standard reports live. I'm going to show you the instance frequency report, we call it. So File, Export, Instance Frequency Report. You get this little window, and you can choose to export or open it. An output window basically is in Studiocode, or you could choose to export it to Excel. So I'll just open it in Studiocode for now. So I'll hit OK there. And then you can see that this window gives you, a nice little summary of, by row, the number of instances in each row, the total time that those instances make up, the percentage relative to the whole movie. So this movie is about 33 minutes and change. All the 115 taxi instances make up about 7 minutes, 25.01 seconds. And then lastly, the mean time per instance there in the last column. So, that's really easy to pull up. It's probably valuable if you're coding anything duration related, like I said. I'll do that again just so you can see the other option, export instance frequency report. This time I'll export it to Excel, right? You could name it, save it wherever you want. I'll just put it on the desktop here. We'll call it frequencies for now. And like all the data points in Studiocode, nothing is ever stuck in Studiocode. You can always get it out into Excel, a CSV, an XML or something that's, non-proprietary, and you can leverage in other applications if you'd like. So that's called the instance frequency report. Next, I'm going to show you the Excel edit list. So like I said, same place. Most of these standard reports live under File, Export, Excel, Edit List. If you're on a previous version, like this is Studio Code version 10, the most recent version. If you're on a previous version, it might just say Edit List here instead of Excel Edit List. But so we'll export this. Again, we'll just send it to the desktop. Now I can open this report. And what the edit list does is nice. It gives you, right, each row is an instance here. So think about it like that. Let's zoom in here a little bit. So the start time, right, gives it to you. The end time. The category essentially is the row name. This is the instance number in that row. This is how many labels live on that given instance. And then really what the edit list is valuable for, if this is meaningful to your work, is the sequentiality of the labels that were applied to a given instance. So these subsequent columns like F, G, H, and so on, they show you the order in which the labels were added to the instance. For some people, that's really valuable. But you'll notice, obviously, since they're organized in this manner of temporality or chronologically, you know, they're not, the labels are not grouped, essentially, right? Like I could have a date in the same column as a different type or a different group of label. So if you care about knowing sequence, that might be valuable, the edit list, sequence of labels, that is. All right. And then the last standard report, which is probably the most universally valuable, and that's because it takes every single possible data point and collects it in one place, is the XML edit list. So I'll export that. You can see the default name is XML edit list. I'll save it to the desktop. Oh, I guess I already got one there. Let's just replace it. Okay. So if you've ever opened up an XML edit list and you're not familiar with it, it may look, you know, like a little gibberish, or it's a lot of computer language. It's structured that way. So we built a nice little translator here where it's really easy. You can just choose that XML edit list and it'll convert it into a CSV, which is sort of formatted in a much more friendly way for most people's work. So I'll save that. And then now if I open it, you can see it's similar to the edit list. Let's zoom in again here. It's similar to the edit list in that you see this, each row is an instance, and you see the start time, end time, and then this report actually gives you the duration there. So that's one less calculation you have to make. Row name again, instance number, the number of labels on the instance, and the unique ID per instance. So in the whole timeline, this is, you know, the unique ID. In case you did any annotation or transcription of the video, it would be here in this column. And then the main difference compared to the edit list is that all the labels are grouped, right? So all the date labels would be in this column. All the direction from which the vehicle entered the intersection would be here, like the east. If we scroll down, you can see other south, north. And so this report really gives you all the data points in one place that you can, you know, leverage in Excel if that's more familiar with you. Or things like charts and graphs typically are easier to do in Excel versus Studiocode. So, you know, if you get to that level, this is a nice sort of go-between between Studiocode and Excel, or maybe like SPSS or other more statistically oriented applications. All right, so those are the standard reports. So now I want to show you the customizable report, which is called a statistical window. And sorry, let me minimize this. I'm not sure if you can see what I'm doing on your screen. But so those reports, are all built in, sort of standard, pre-formatted. But you can create your own customizable formats here by going to File, New, Statistical Window, or like I said, we call it the Stat window. So here's the Stat window, and the idea here is that it's a spreadsheet, right? Much like Excel, you can add columns and rows. And the idea is to build here a little layout that this report or table that you build in the stat window then becomes a template that you can use with any movie package. So for example, let's say, here's the taxi, of all the taxis and buses, let's just say I want to get something very simple like a count. Obviously, you can get the counts already, in the matrix and other places, but I'm just going to give you a very basic idea of how this works. So in each cell, you can write a little script or formula, much like you'd write one in Excel, in a cell, and that formula will just read the open timeline and return the information there. So I'm going to use this language, or these scripts: show count instances where row equals taxi. So I'm just getting a count, right? This is our little language. And that's something really simple I could do. Something you can't do in the matrix is maybe get the duration of those, right? So I could do something simple like this. And that gives it to me in seconds. I could then, display that in minutes or in a timer format, or do any sorts of calculations like that. So if you want to report where you're looking at like durations, ratios, percentages, all the instances with a given label or combinations of labels on them, the stat window is, typically the place where you can be the most efficient, I guess, about reporting. So what I mean by this, in terms of being a template file, the stat window is, this script in this cell is reading this timeline. But the beauty of it is that once you take the time to build the statistical window, it becomes a template. And I could just open up, let's say, that was intersection 1. Let's open intersection 2. Intersection 2 is another movie package. You can see that I coded. I would have used the same code window, so my row names are the same, and labels are the same, but the counts are different, right? And you can see already that these counts and durations already updated based on whatever little repository of information, meaning a timeline, that I put behind it. So hopefully that gives you a little idea of how the statistical window could become a template file. Let's not save that. I built another one just to give you a little better idea, maybe. So here's a stat window that I built. And basically, I'm just looking for each type of vehicle, taxi, bus, or bicycle, what direction it entered the intersection at, like from the north, south, east, or west, and if the percentage basically of the instances that it entered, were they legal or illegal. And my threshold for legality is like it is 70%. Like if 70% of the times one of these vehicles entered the intersection from the north in a legal manner, then I consider that like a safe sort of direction of the intersection. So let's back up. Let me close this and I'll hit execute. So you can see that, right, this report, this stat window, there really are no numbers in it. There's just these little formulas. So I was showing you intersection 2 just a second ago. Let me open intersection 1. And when I open it, watch what happens to the stat window. I have multiple, if you're not familiar with this little window, I just have multiple timelines inside this package. So I'm just choosing this particular timeline. When I open that, the stat window automatically just generates, the information I'm looking for based on this timeline. And I've scripted it in such a way that if, in terms of the legal columns, it doesn't meet my criteria for, safety, which is 70%, it'll turn that cell red. And if it does, it'll turn that cell green. Just maybe a little more, easy to identify that safety rating, so to speak. And then again, like the matrix I was mentioning earlier, what's really powerful about the stat window, something you cannot do in Excel, is that you can marry the evidence to this window. So for example, this is legal times that the taxi entered from the north, this 38.9% of the time. But I can see here that there's 21 actual instances. And not only do I get the count, I can also just double click on that cell and it'll go find those 21 instances and play them for me back to back in this new movie window. Right? So I think it's really powerful to be able to pull up the video like that. And hopefully you can see, how efficient it is to build this template once. You may have different templates, different stat windows to reflect different types of reports, obviously. But once you build it, then you can just open it up with, any movie package or combination of movie packages. For example, this is just one movie, right? One intersection, one day. What if I opened up, I created what we call a combined timeline, which has intersections 1 and 2. And now all these percentages just regenerated again. So let me just make sure you understand this. In this movie package, there's this movie, right? And intersection 2. So this is what we call a combined timeline. I could create a combined timeline that has, many dozens or hundreds of movies in it. And then again, my report would now I can, just reflect that sample size of data. And like, if I wanted to find all the legal times a bicycle entered from the north, I could just double click this cell and now I retrieve all those instances across, the whole scope of my video. That makes sense. So let's see, it's 10:20. I'm going to show you a couple different examples. Or does anyone have any questions at this point? I was going to show you a couple other examples of how the stat window might be leveraged, but any questions?
I have a question about the script language you were using when you were creating the statistical window.
Yes.
Is there like a go-to place for specific syntax, or is it just like how do you generate those scripts?
Yeah, great question. So in the Studiocode software, under the help menu, you can go to statistical command help, and all the syntax and examples are listed here. So, they're categorized also by the types of commands, but here, for example, is what, like the timer. If I wanted to, I gave you that example where those instances made up, I don't know what it was, 400 something seconds. I could display those seconds, right, as a timer, we call it, or a clock, if that's more helpful. But all of that lives under the Studiocode help menu. Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a good question. Anything else coming to mind for anyone? Otherwise, I can show you a couple other examples of sometimes how stat windows may be used. All right, I'll keep going here. So here's an interesting example of a stat window. Let me open their code window first and show you how they code. So this is they're coding the performance of someone in a clinical environment, or a simulated clinical environment, I should say. And here are some categories they're interested in giving basically a rating for the performance of, right? Call for early help, followership, team building. Most of this is leadership oriented, right? For each one of these categories, they need to give a score from -5 to 5 and exactly 1. They need to make sure that they have, and sorry, these are labels. These scoring system are labels. So they need to make sure the instances have exactly 1 of any of these categoried labels on every instance. Okay, so they use the stat window to do a nice little check. So let's open the stat window. So here's the stat window. Okay. And like I said, this is, a template. So right now, this statistical window there's no timeline open, and it's telling us we're missing some labels. It cannot read, it can't find the labels to count. So let me open up the timeline here. So here's a timeline. And you can see the stat window just automatically updated, right? So now we can see the scores for every category that are call for early help. And then there's subcategories. But let's say, for example, along the way when they're coding, let me right click here. You can see this particular instance has a label of +1. Let's just say they forgot to label that given instance from that category. You can see that they get this little alert. Is the phase complete? No, there's only 15 of 16 items, meaning 15 of 16 labels, and then it shows them the actual, label and category that they're missing, so that they can go back and relabel. So watch, if I put that label back on, then you can see the score there. So it's kind of like a fact checker for, very intricate coding. If your coding happens to be that structured, could be very useful. That's one idea. Here's another idea. Yeah, this is it. So this has to do with teamwork and communication, whether when certain communication protocols should be implemented, like the completeness or the incompleteness of whether, like a role was designated or there was a clear leader established, things like that. So, by default, we can just leave these cells blank. Here's a timeline. Oops, sorry. Here's a timeline to execute it against, and now you can see all these cells just report back based on what was coded, the performance. And they also have another one here, which is nice to see in terms of duration, I think. Yeah. So for example, in a simulated environment, if a patient entered a particular heart rhythm, they want to know how long it took that participant in the simulation to decide to identify and decide to shock and pace, and how long it took them to prepare the pacemaker, right? And things like that. So this is a nice, tidy report where they can get all that in one place. Okay, lastly, I was going to show you, let me bring back up. I was going to show you just some data visualization, because I think it's closely tied to reporting. Like I said, we'll spend more time on this in depth in another webinar, but just to give you an idea, let's open this, and then I'll open the output window or the code window. Actually, let me do it in reverse so I can show you this first. Sorry, I need to open this sort of the long way because I have too many sort of toys on my computer. But so this is a code window, right? It's just a code window. Most people use a code window to code a timeline and input information into the timeline. But a code window can also report back some information. So let's say I opened, again, that intersection 1 movie package, and right, and I showed you also the stat window, right? So this stat window shows you some information based on this given timeline. But maybe visually, it's not as compelling to look at it as it would be, and maybe, or it is not as compelling to look at it in a report as it would be in maybe a visual like this. So I could, say what, coming from the north, when a bus makes a turn, it's like very unsafe sort of direction from the intersection. But what happens if they, let's say they come from the east, right? Or what happens when they come from the south? But basically, the code window is like a blank canvas, and we can drop in images in there and make some interactive, little data visualizations like this. We could also retrieve the video straight from this code window. I didn't actually script this code window that way, but like I could, let's say, double click on this thumbs up and up pops the bus clips for that part of the intersection. So yeah, that's all possible in Studiocode. Any questions that I can help answer at this point?
This might be a question that is answered just by looking more carefully at the different script things, but in combining multiple packages and using a statistical window, is there a way to make comparisons across the different movie packages?
Such as?
So for example, we have video packages of teachers at different points in a teacher preparation program.
Mm-hmm.
If I wanted to compare the codes or the labels at the beginning of the program versus the end of the program.
Yeah, sure. So and you're thinking about that like in terms of dates then, or?
So we're using the same code window to look at the videos, but to see if there's like a significant shift in the number of instances that are labeled with, for example, looking at like mathematical knowledge for teaching that like received that label.
Okay. So yeah, really, really good question. I think the way I think about that with Studiocode is anything that you want to, measure, report, retrieve, is always based on one and only one of three things, like a code, a label, or a group. So typically, let's say you wanted to see a given behavior of a person on day 1 versus day 10. The way just based on what you've told me without asking you a million other questions, is if you have an instance with a label on it on day 1, and you want to compare that to day 10, what typically makes sense is to apply a label to all the instances in the day 1 movie package with that given date. And then same with day 10. That way you can find all the instances with a particular, label on it from one date versus that same type of instance with the same label from another date. But, I think sometimes people think, I'll say it this way, I think sometimes people expect that because your movie was recorded on it, the actual movie file was recorded on a given date or things like that, that's queryable by Studiocode, but it isn't necessarily. It needs to be a code, a label, or a group. And the most flexibility in terms of reporting and drilling down to more specific types of data points comes with labels, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful.
Sure. There's a couple of video tutorials we have online sort of that come to mind as well. Because like if you're in classroom research, I think typically like dates or maybe locations, there's a really easy way to add a label with a date or a location or a teacher name or something like that to all the instances in a given timeline with one click. So, feel free to email me after. You can email us at support@vosaic.com, and then I can point you towards those resources. Okay, well, thanks for joining. Join us next Wednesday, the first Wednesday of every month, 12 p.m. Central, and that will be our next webinar. Thanks.